W.E.B. in the W.E.B. Du Bois Department of Afro-American Studies at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst, Massachusetts. He has been a visiting scholar at Harvard University's Charles Warren Center for Studies in American History and a Woodrow Wilson National Foundation Career Enhancement Fellow. He is a co-author of Rethinking the American Prison Movement, published by Routledge in 2017 with Dan Berger, and he's preparing a book manuscript tentatively titled War for the City, Black Liberation and a Consolidation of the Carceral State. In addition to his scholarly work, Dr. Losier is a former organizer with the Chicago anti-eviction campaign, having coordinated the campaign's direct outreach to homes in foreclosure, as well as the legal defense of families at risk of eviction. He is also a former volunteer with the South Side Together, organizing for Power or Stop, working closely with the community organizing efforts of its youth group in response to the mass incarceration of African American juveniles and the lack of adult trauma care on Chicago's South Side. Currently, he's an active member of the Black Alliance for Peace, or BAP, a people-centered human rights project against war, repression, and imperialism. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Losier for his prepared remarks today on The Other Attica is Already Upon Us, Prison Organizing, COVID-19, and the Crises of Mass Incarceration. Dr. Losier, over to you. Excuse me, 1 minute. Dr. Losier, I'm not getting audio from you right now.
I'm sorry, you should be able to hear me now. I was simply saying thank you for the very generous introduction, as well as the opportunity to speak with you all and to really lead off this this lecture series, especially on this third day of Black History Month. I wanted to start off my talk today by speaking to just the general focus of my remarks, which is the ways in which the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic has intersected with broader longstanding issues that have shaped the emergence of what scholars refer to as mass incarceration. And in my prepared remarks, I'm very much interested in looking at the ways in which our opportunity to examine some of the ways in which not simply the dynamics of the pandemic have impacted individuals held behind bars, but also the ways in which examining the dynamics of what's taking place behind bars really has an opportunity to highlight how much, when we reflect on sort of what transpired over the past 2 years of the pandemic, that in many ways, its circumstances within prisons that really served as a flashpoint for initial sort of public discussion around the public health responses. I'll be touching a bit on events that took place last spring in St. Louis that are captured here on the title page of my presentation, where in the St. Louis County Justice Center, several rounds of protests were held around long court delays and the lack of personal protective equipment being provided to those who were held in the Justice Center awaiting trial. But I'm going to start off my remarks by touching actually on a different event that took place in 2020, specifically fall of 2020. And it was in the fall of 2020 that law students with the Harvard Prison Divestment campaign hosted a webinar with prison organizers and their outside supporters that in many ways speaks directly to the current crisis facing U.S. criminal justice system. In particular, a representative from Jailhouse Lawyers Speak, a network of incarcerated human rights organizers, was asked about a recent social media post suggesting that prisoners were predicting another Attica soon, but more widespread, was a specific quote. Pressed as to how supporters at Harvard Law and other places across the country might begin to prepare for any kind of turmoil or protests taking place behind bars, the spokesperson for Jailhouse Lawyers Speak, or as it's known in other ways, JLS, simply offered the following, and here I'm going to quote. From our perspective, we feel like the other Attica is already upon us. We're already in it. It's just not the same. It doesn't look the same. The callousness, the conditions, the death rates, the COVID-19, the murders. We're seeing suicides, drug overdoses daily around the country. So we think we're already in the midst of an Attica. We're not looking for it to come in the way that the previous Attica came. It's taking on a different tenor, a different color, a different flavor. So we're not anticipating, we're already here. Far from hyperbolic, this reference to the iconic 1971 Attica prison revolt seems prescient. For 4 days, more than 1,000 prisoners at the upstate New York facility held control over much of the prison, raising demands for better living conditions, fair wages, and political rights at the notoriously harsh institution. Far more than any of the dozens of other instances of unrest behind bars, this one captured the nation's attention. As prison officials conceded to one of the prisoners' demands and allowed journalists and television crews to enter the grounds of the prison. For several days, those held in one of the nation's toughest prisons spoke directly to the public about their conditions of confinement and their desire for change. Although best remembered for the ways in which the revolt's bloody suppression by state police and correctional officers left 34 prisoners and 10 civilian staff dead, Attica would remain the most significant flashpoint of the 1960s and 70s, a protracted period of unrest in prisons and jails across the country. Understanding Attica in this way as a key historical flashpoint and as a moment of unprecedented visibility might help explain why one might say Attica is already here. According to a 2020 report by the archival group Perilous, this country is in the midst of what is, quote, clearly one of the most massive waves of prisoner resistance in past decades, end quote. Beginning on March 17th with one of the first reported COVID-19 related hunger strikes in a jail, a trickle of protests has turned into a rising demand for basic protections to prisoner and inmate health and safety. As officials at prisons and jails and migrant detention centers have been slow to provide PPE and cleaning supplies, or to require the CDC guidelines around the wearing of masks by guards or physical distancing by inmates be enforced, those held behind bars have taken action. Over the course of the spring and summer of 2020, the first 90 days of the pandemic in the US, researchers cataloged 119 instances of protests, hunger strikes, work stoppages, and other attacks or protests regarding staff behavior. Rather than abating, this trend of the spring and summer has continued into the fall and winter of 2020 as new waves of coronavirus infections have sparked demands for compliance with basic public health measures. Generally, this record of historically unprecedented unrest has been taken as an indicator of a broader failure by local and state officials to stem the spread of COVID-19 behind bars. Indeed, the rampant spread of COVID-19 in places like Chicago's Cook County Jail and California's Substance Abuse Treatment Facility in Corcoran, a spread that has and continues to make these places leading hotspots for infection and disease spread is unacceptable. Yet this record of unprecedented unrest also highlights something profound about the contours of our contemporary criminal justice system. Rather than simply an unfortunate situation or an aberration, it is worth considering that just as the COVID-19 pandemic has exposed and accelerated already glaring inequalities and failings within our broader social system, that at the same time it is doing the same thing with mass incarceration. To the degree that this ongoing unrest builds on a decade-long series of hunger strikes, work stoppages, and other nationwide protests behind bars, it stands to reason that our current Attica moment is exposing and accelerating a series of crises that has been brewing behind bars for some time. And it stands to reason that Attica, as a symbol of the radical prisoner organizing of the 1960s and 70s, that in some ways laid the foundation for current approaches to prison management, that this wave of unrest ongoing now has the potential to play a role in reshaping the place of prisons and jails in our society in the future. Since the publication of Mark Mauer's book, Race to Incarcerate, in 1999, mass incarceration has come to serve as a shorthand way of talking about the relative size and scale of U.S. imprisonment. Although the system itself is fragmented, with various aspects of it being overseen by municipal, county, state, and federal authorities, this big picture formulation is both clarifying and provocative. It offers, for instance, a sense of its size. If the U.S. prison population were a city, it would be the 5th largest one in the country, significantly ahead of Phoenix and just behind Houston. And you can see, at least a little bit from this graph here, how fragmented the overall big picture sense of the population behind bars is segmented related to federal prisons as well as state prisons and local jail facilities. In contrast to a popular conception, hardly any of this reliance on incarceration is directly attributable to privately managed prisons, as these facilities hold only 8.4% of the larger prison population. According to the Prison Policy Initiative, whose slide I'm showing you now, the overwhelming majority of those held behind bars are in publicly owned and operated facilities, including some 102 federal prisons, just over 900 juvenile correctional facilities, almost 1,800 state prisons, and just over 3,000 local jails. The emergence of mass incarceration is most closely associated with the war on drugs, a campaign of domestic policing, federal prohibition, and military intervention that began in 1971. 11 years later, newly elected President Ronald Reagan officially reinforced and expanded it. Yet, as important as this campaign has been for reshaping the ways in which criminal justice works at the federal level, where nearly half of all incarcerated people are held on nonviolent drug convictions, often serving lengthy sentences as a result, the circumstances in state and local jails where most people are held differs to some degree. Here, crimes like assault and robbery, as well as property and public order offenses, make up the majority of those that have sent men and women to prison. Similarly, the makeup of those held behind bars also reflects stark racial inequalities, with African Americans making up just 12% of the US population, but more than 1/3 of federal and state prison populations. At the same time, it's important to note that since 2009, when the total prison population peaked before declining incrementally, this stark racial disparity has declined slightly over the past several years, as the number of Black people has dropped roughly about 17%, somewhat higher than the 10% decline in the number of their white counterparts held behind bars. And then while there are several reasons why these racial disparities have shrunk to some degree, it remains clear that with upwards of 90 to 95% of all criminal convictions the result of a plea bargain, and nearly 2/3 of those held in jail awaiting trial, that a lack of access to quality legal representation, in many ways the marker of one's class position, rounds out the lives of not only individuals and families, but also poor and working class communities enmeshed within the criminal justice system more generally. In addition to the system's scale, it's also worth noting that the character of mass incarceration is more than simply a question of numbers. Prisons in the US would be discussed quite differently if, for instance, the primary activity that prisoners were engaged in was that of productive labor. This was certainly the case a century ago, a period best associated with the chain gang, prison industries, and the notorious convict lease system, a highly exploitive form of prison management that provided cheap labor for a range of industries and corporations, primarily in the U.S. South. In contrast, while there remain some variations as to how each state provides opportunities for prison labor, most people held behind bars may work jobs contracted to their institution or associated with its daily operation. But in the final analysis, they spend most of their time idle. Rather than putting to work incarcerated people, most of them young men in the prime of their lives, this system is premised upon their incapacitation. This goal of incapacitation is even reflected in how prisons during this era have been built and managed, what could be called the warehouse model of imprisonment. From Connecticut to California, prisons and jails of this era routinely face severe overcrowding, stern discipline, and minimal rehabilitative programming, and limited mental health care. The most extreme form of punishment under this model is one of long-term solitary confinement, reflected in both the control unit segment of a prison and the standalone supermax or supermaximum security correctional facility. Each take the incapacitation goal of the warehouse prison to its logical conclusion, as people incarcerated here spend 20 to 24 hours a day locked in a small cell with little to no human contact. In 1986, Arizona became the first state to open a supermax facility. 3 years later, California would be the second, transferring its most troublesome prisoners to the newly built Pelican Bay State Prison. By 1995, there would be 20 supermax prisons across the country. Within the decade, that number had reached nearly 30. Designed not for rehabilitative purposes, but to discourage unrest and isolate those seen as key agitators, these prisons reflect an institutional backlash to the radical prison organizing of the 1960s and 70s. This relationship between prison organizing and mass incarceration is a significant and often overlooked point. During the course of the 1980s and 1990s, the rise of the U.S. Prison population, as well as the shift to the warehouse prison as a new form of prison management, was premised on the suppression of the prison organizing ascendant during the 60s and 70s, the heyday of the Attica Rebellion. State officials did not simply build more prisons, but they commissioned increasingly severe, riot-proof facilities. These new prisons were designed to hold captive a population that might regularly exceed official capacity, while limiting the space in which imprisoned men and women might move about, congregate, and potentially seek to gain control of the institution. Although the prison buildup touched every corner of the country, it had its greatest impact across the southern portion of the U.S., a region known as the Sun Belt. There, officials turned to prison construction as a way to meet the requirements of court-mandated reforms, assuage concerns for growing racial disorder, and respond to concerns regarding rural disinvestment while realizing the benefits of tough-on-crime politics. Ultimately, these pressures galvanized southern states, most of them known for their commitments to frugality and small government, to designate ever larger budget allocations to prison construction and management. By 1995, this region was locking up 44% of all state prisoners, even though it accounted for a much smaller percentage of the nation's total population. From Florida and Georgia to Texas and California, the Sun Belt has been at the forefront of this new system of mass incarceration. This new system has also been shaped by rolling back the gains incarcerated people had secured by gaining access to the courts. Beginning in the 1960s, prisoners who petitioned the courts on matters of constitutional law, oftentimes referred to as jailhouse lawyers, had found ways to gain a hearing in federal court. Overcoming a long-standing tradition where judges had avoided addressing nearly all prison-related issues, jailhouse lawyers won access to the federal courts as a venue that offered them a limited set of basic civil and procedural rights. As a result of their efforts, as well as the support of outside legal organizations, prison systems across the country, but especially in the Sun Belt, had been forced to make prison conditions more humane. By the 1980s, however, correctional officials increasingly use these court-ordered reform mandates to modernize and build up their prisons in a manner premised not on the human rights of those held behind bars, but on the need to control them. The courts would quickly follow this shift towards prioritizing prisoner control and institutional security above all else. As officials built more warehouse-style prisons, a series of U.S. Supreme Court cases, from Jones versus North Carolina in 1977, which emphasized the security needs of prison administrators, to Rhodes versus Chapman, 1981, which undercut claims of cruel and unusual punishment, to Rufo versus inmates of Suffolk County, 1992, which encouraged lower courts to defer to the authority of state and local officials when ruling on matters of prison and jail administration. These cases marked a significant retreat from a prior standard of judicial intervention on matters of prisoners' rights. For its part, the U.S. Congress would draw on the court's example by enacting two key laws that further constrain the ability of men and women behind bars to gain a fair hearing in federal court. Touted as a measure that would decrease the volume of prisoner-initiated lawsuits, the 1996 Prison Litigation Reform Act, or PLRA, made it harder for those held behind bars to get relief from the courts. We can see how that was a successful consequence of this act from the graph on the screen here. The PLRA enacted a strict exhaustion requirement stipulating that jailhouse lawyers had the first attempt to remedy the complaints through administrative measures before they could file in court. The new law also limited to 3 the number of quote-unquote frivolous cases a prisoner could file, while also requiring them to now take the cost of filing a suit in federal court and narrowing the scope of injunctive relief federal judges can impose if they decide the case in the prisoner's favor. Just as the PLRA made it harder for prisoners to use the courts as a venue through which they could demand better treatment, the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act of 1996 also imposed more stringent standards on state prisoners, particularly those on death row, seeking to raise issues regarding their case in federal court. Although these laws did not mark a full return to the hands-off doctrine that had long governed the relationship between prisons and the rest of society, they complemented prior court rulings, administrative innovations, and court sensibilities that roll back the gains won by incarcerated people during the 1960s and 70s. While prisons had briefly been a key site of political activity and public engagement, these changes increasingly helped to shield these institutions from outside engagement, effectively returning them to the margins of society. As stable as this system of mass incarceration might seem, much of what has taken place over the past several years, particularly in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, has helped to reveal the degree to which it is also beset by crises. While far from a house of cards teetering on the edge of collapse, it is one increasingly defined by the distance between expectation and reality. This distance and the crisis it engenders is best reflected in 3 key areas: institutional legitimacy, fiscal constraints, and demographic pressures. While they have emerged in succession, these 3 crises have increasingly overlapped with one another, and their management will help to determine how the U.S. criminal justice system functions in the future. The first of these crises to emerge has been the crisis of legitimacy, as the general purpose of incarceration has been called into question to some degree. Critiques of the place of prisons in U.S. society that might once have been dismissed as radical have increasingly found their place in public conversation. Much of this shift has been a result of studies undertaken by policy experts, legal advocates, and professional academics. To some degree, this crisis of legitimacy has called attention to the human cost of the decades-long buildup of the U.S. prison system, a cost increasingly exposed not only by radical scholars like Angela Davis and Christian Parenti, but also more mainstream figures like Michelle Alexander and William Stuntz. Perhaps no other account of mass incarceration better reflects the emergence of this crisis than the introduction of Alexander's 2011 book, The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Era of Colorblindness, where she recounts the distance that she herself traveled from initially dismissing grassroots activists' depiction of mass incarceration as the quote-unquote new Jim Crow, as simply hyperbolic, to later taking these claims to be true and even making them the title of her best-selling book. Outside of the academy, the shift is increasingly reflected in the theater of public opinion, as a tough-on-crime rhetoric that was once politically popular has lost much of its traction. In most parts of the country, capital punishment has been left largely indefensible. The use of DNA tests to exonerate hundreds of wrongfully convicted prisoners has challenged the way many now talk about guilt and innocence. In place of the punitive approach to policy that was once hegemonic, proponents of smarter on crime policies have made headway in key states, pushing for moderate reforms to sentencing and prison policy, and further undermining the legitimacy of large-scale mass incarceration. Overlapping with this legitimacy crisis has been a fiscal one, as various states have found it increasingly difficult to bear the costs of managing the prison system that they once spent several decades expanding. And as the general public has slowly become more open to those voices calling into question the purpose of mass incarceration, the percentage of county and state budget allocations it absorbs has become less publicly palatable. And in the wake of the 2007 and 8 financial crisis and the recession that followed, this fiscal crisis has hit hard at the prolonged decline. This fiscal crisis hit hard with the prolonged decline in economic growth, widened state budget deficits. As revenue declined, state officials were less inclined to float bonds to fund the construction of new prisons, as well as pay for the administration of existing facilities, as budget pressures have led to cuts in prison staffing and programming. These cuts have been felt particularly hard across the Sun Belt, and even though the broader economy grew out of the recession, its effects still lingered. No other recent event better reflects the human consequences of this crisis than a bloody riot that took place earlier in 2019 in South Carolina's large maximum security facility, Lee Correctional Institution. Opened in 1993, Lee quickly became known as the state's most dangerous prison, with incarcerated people repeatedly taking over parts of the facility and holding guards hostage between 2012 and 2016. Until prison officials increasingly moved to pit prisoners against each other, even busing in violent offenders from other institutions to concentrate them in one place. And I misspoke earlier, I said 2019. This riot took place in 2018. Indeed, it broke out on the evening of April 15th, 2018, leaving 7 prisoners dead and a dozen more wounded, making it the deadliest prison disturbance in recent memory. Although media accounts depicted the deadly incident as the inevitable result of rival gangs wielding handmade knives and contraband cell phones, critical observers have pointed to a set of systemic issues like chronic understaffing, routine overcrowding, and generally inhumane conditions that have worsened in South Carolina's prisons, but in Lee in particular, as the state has routinely been among the worst in the country for correctional spending. And as South Carolina has failed to allocate more money to hire new guards, provide rehabilitative programming, and improve other aspects of prison life, the number of prisoners killed more than doubled in 2017 from the year before and quadrupled from 2 years earlier. As men and women held behind bars have been made to bear the brunt of these fiscal pressures, some have taken the violence of their conditions out on each other. This sort of prisoner-on-prisoner violence has obscured the development of a third demographic crisis. For several decades, mass incarceration has been premised on holding larger numbers of people behind bars for longer periods of time, typified by mandatory minimum sentences, gang enhancements, and life sentences without the possibility of parole. While politically popular at the outset, this highly punitive sentencing structure failed to anticipate the mounting costs state and federal prison systems would face as those convicted under these laws increasingly began to age into their senior years in institutions unprepared to meet their growing physical needs, as well as the costs associated with increased mental and medical health care services. While still very much a hidden problem, this third crisis has increasingly come to a head, particularly amidst a viral pandemic that continues to pose a particularly dangerous threat to the oldest members of our society, even those held behind bars facing routine budget shortfalls and decreased public confidence. This COVID-19 pandemic has directly touched on these overlapping crises. Prior to its onset, there have been some efforts across a number of states to decrease their overall prison population. In many instances, this largely involved a shifting of imprisoned men and women from state prison facilities to county jails. The onset of the pandemic placed new pressures on these facilities, wholly unprepared to provide those stuffed into cramped cells with the means to socially distance, much less provide personal protective equipment. As a result, many of these facilities sought to release prisoners to the relative safety of their home communities. This was particularly true for older prisoners, acutely at risk if they were to catch the virus. Efforts to rapidly release prisoners that might have been dismissed out of hand in the past were increasingly taken up in the moment of the pandemic. Yet despite these efforts, a number of prisons and jails quickly boasted clusters of the novel coronavirus as it ripped through the close quarters of institutions designed to hold humans captives, but not to attend to their well-being. Indeed, by the summer of 2020, prisons and jails ranked alongside factories as hotspots for new infections, leading to the death of thousands. As state and local leaders failed to provide more drastic action to prevent those behind bars from being in the direct path of the disease, prisoners themselves took action. At times, bolstered by the support of outside demonstrators, inmates, prisoners, and detainees have consistently pressed demands that they be provided with the means to keep themselves safe from a COVID-19 infection. In doing so, they reflected the ways in which, throughout the course of the 20th century, the prison movement has encompassed a broad range of efforts to advance the human rights of incarcerated people, often through active collaboration with outside supporters. While at times radical and visionary, prisoner activism has usually been from outside seen as fractured and episodic. This movement has still caught the public's attention during high-profile moments of revolt and insurrection, but also relied on often ignored forms of resistance, making it possible for providing ways by which incarcerated people might take up or avoid the dealing with the harms associated with prison conditions. This unprecedented wave of protests behind bars beginning in the spring of 2020, built on nearly a decade of organizing and mobilization on both sides of the prison wall. On December 9th, 2010, prisoners in Georgia launched a statewide work strike after secretly coordinating their efforts by using contraband cell phones. Planned as a one-day strike, this protest caught officials by surprise. Organizers used a set of 9 demands, calling for a living wage for work, increased educational opportunities, decent health care and living conditions, vocational training, greater access to family members, and more just parole decisions, raising these demands during the course of their protest. Despite their initial plans, the strike would continue for 6 days, as prison officials responded by locking down entire prisons, cutting off hot water, confiscating cell phones, and transferring suspected strike organizers to different facilities. In several cases, guards pepper sprayed and tear gas strikers indiscriminately, then beat those who were ultimately identified as strike leaders. Other strikes and uprisings would break out in prisons and immigrant detention centers in Alabama, Ohio, North Carolina, Texas, Washington, West Virginia, and elsewhere. The biggest occurred at California's Pelican Bay, one of the nation's first supermax prisons. There, prisoners staged 3 hunger strikes between 2011 and 2013, protesting long-term solitary confinement. At its height in 2013, 30,000 incarcerated people throughout the state joined in support of their leadership's collective's 5 demands. The strike yielded a legal settlement that removed almost all of California's incarcerated people from long-term solitary confinement. It also produced a historic statement calling for multiracial unity, itself produced by Black, Chicano, and white prisoners, who authorities claimed constituted the leaders of rival gangs. This success undermined the historic racial division of California's prisons, suggesting new opportunities for unity amongst incarcerated people. On September 9th, 2016, an estimated 24,000 prisoners began what would become the largest prison strike in U.S. history. Called for by the prison-based Free Alabama movement, or FAM, and scheduled to coincide with the 45th anniversary of the Attica Rebellion. In years prior, FAM organizers had cut their teeth by leading a series of strikes, hostage takings, and other protests that had shaken Alabama's prison system and prompted calls for prison reform. Rather than a cohesive list of demands, grievances driving the national prison strike varied from state to state, and strike activities continued for up to 3 weeks. The Incarcerated Workers Organizing Committee, a project of the Industrial Workers of the World, a militant labor union, played a key role in providing outside support. While several key prison organizers would be targeted for punishment, this strike demonstrated the emergence of a movement seeking to engage prisoners and outside supporters on a national scale. This push for both national scale and outside support would be reflected in the call for an even larger prison strike in 2018. In the wake of the bloody riot in Lee County in South Carolina, organizers with Jailhouse Lawyers Speak announced the 2018 strike as a way to redirect the attention of both incarcerated people and the general public from the violence at Lee Prison to the underlying systemic issues that has sparked the tragic loss of life there. Outlined in a set of 10 demands, this strike proposal and a list of grievances called for basic improvements to prison conditions, the reform of harsh sentencing practices, and the restoration of basic constitutional rights to those held behind bars. Moreover, JLS sought to incorporate outside supporters into its effort to spread the strike call. In an effort to avoid the sort of targeted repression faced by organizers of previous strikes, JLS organizers explicitly refused to personally identify themselves to the public and continue to organize even when outside of the public eye. And while it did not spread as broadly as previous national strikes, this latest one that took place in 2018 garnered significant mainstream media attention, shedding considerable light on the struggles breaking out behind prison walls, as well as their key demands, including the repeal of the Prison Litigation Reform Act of 1996. Even after the end of the strike, incarcerated people and their outside supporters would continue to press these 10 demands, with a view that reforms on these individual issues would push forward a broader effort to build on the legacy of Attica and reshape the landscape of incarceration in this country. More tangibly, this practice of inside-outside solidarity, whether between prison organizers, law school students, or immigrant detainees and civilian supporters, would ultimately lay the foundation for the eruption of protests behind bars that we've seen take place during the COVID-19 pandemic. Though far less bloody than the 1971 Attica Revolt, the protests had erupted initially in the spring of 2020 and have continued for nearly 2 years since, including the events that took place in the St. Louis Justice Center in Missouri in 2021, have drawn upon the idea that the outside world was watching. Amidst a nearly unchecked spread of COVID behind bars, the 2020 protests did win increasing access to protective equipment, early release for tens of thousands of prisoners, and a host of increasingly bold criminal justice reforms, like the end of cash bail. This growing movement behind bars, despite active efforts to undercut and roll back its gains, is likely to play a significant role in actively shaping the ways in which the broader crises at the heart of the U.S. system of mass incarceration, its legitimacy crisis, its fiscal crisis, and its demographic crisis are attended to over the years to come.
Dr. Losier, thank you so much for your remarks and your presentation today. I do want to remind our audience members that questions to Dr. Losier can be sent now to library@hvcc.edu. I will share any questions received with Dr. Losier now. I do have a question for you that's more kind of a background question, and I wondered if you could address, in your description of your remarks today, you used the term carceral state, and for many of us are unfamiliar with the carceral state, and I wondered if you could define it for us, and I wanted to ask you if there's other carceral states around the globe, and if you could identify what those are, and then I have a follow-up that I'll ask you.
Sure. So first and foremost, thank you for the question. The carceral state, to some degree, is sort of a theoretical concept that scholars have begun using as a way to talk about the elements of the criminal justice system in a sort of a broad sense. So oftentimes the conversation, and this was sort of reflected in my talk today, around issues of criminal justice will focus on, say, just prisons or policing, or perhaps courts as separate institutions. And part of what myself and other scholars have sought to do by drawing on the concept of the carceral state is provide a forum in which these institutions within the broader criminal justice system can be described and discussed in concert with one another. And this is sometimes a tricky thing to do because this discussion is taking place relative to institutions that are operating on different jurisdictional levels and obviously different sort of geographical levels. So you're talking about courts, processes of court adjudication, policing, state and federal confinement, as well as immigration detention as well too. And these are not organized or administered in a sort of uniform way. But the intervention in terms of referring to the carceral state is an attempt to identify the ways in which there are some threads, some continuity that range across these different institutions and their sort of different levels of governance, and speak about them in as a whole. And so the concept of saying that there is a carceral state in the United States, or referring to the carceral state, is an effort to kind of approach the question of these institutions with that kind of like big picture perspective, and in a manner that would be equally applicable to other countries in terms of talking about, for instance, the Brazilian carceral state or the Turkish carceral state. But part of what is implicit in the reference to the carceral state, particularly as it's been applied in the U.S., is an indication that there is a particular kind of element of governance and significant degree of state capacity that's been built up, and that is kind of warrants the particular attention that scholars have begun to bring to bear in terms of referencing the carceral state, at least here in the United States.
Thank you for that explanation. I think I had misunderstood the term, so I'm going to withdraw my follow-up question. So my another question I have is, what do you see as some of the greatest challenges to advocate for the human rights of incarcerated persons, given the very large number of social inequities and challenges we face as a nation?
Yeah, I think that's first of all, that's a great question. And one of the things that I've been sort of most interested in, at least through the scholarship, is looking at the ways in which incarcerated people have tried to answer that question to some degree themselves, and have really tried to find ways to advocate for a greater access to civil and human rights while held behind bars. One of the things that I think is probably one of the largest obstacles to seeing a kind of tangible change is really first and foremost a lot of the stigma that we sort of generally oftentimes associate with the criminal justice system more broadly, but especially with folks who are held behind bars. A recent study found that probably 1 out of 2 Americans has a family member or a loved one who's held in prison, and that the consequences of mass incarceration, and obviously I think these numbers were developed before the pandemic, so it might have changed slightly as the numbers of those held behind bars has sort of dipped with some of the releases that I mentioned in my talk. But many of us know individuals who are held behind bars. Many of us know not only the ways in which a number of those individuals have their own problems that they're dealing with, that they're wrestling with, but also in many ways how the dynamics of incarceration oftentimes hinder rather than help their further development and their ability to improve their lives and improve themselves as people. And that's not often, because of the sort of stigma associated with the facts of incarceration. Those are oftentimes relationships that we feel comfortable listing up and being able to sort of use as sort of the basis of thinking about the need to sort of change the way in which prison systems operate and ensure that if we are going to be incarcerating such large numbers of people, right now our prison population is still the largest, not only in the world, but really in human history. We have the largest prison population. That if we are going to be locking up so many people, many of them, people that we might have a personal relationship with, that we could at least make sure that the experience of incarceration is going to operate in such a way where folks come out of prison in a better position than when they went in, such that the consequences of incarceration are going to be beneficial to society rather than being detrimental. And in many ways, that stigma, aside from a host of other factors, whether it's sort of, the kind of political incentives of sort of genuflecting to a kind of tough on crime politics, the ways in which we kind of feel pretty comfortable in terms of having prisons at the margins of our society, questions of racism, questions of patriarchy in terms of how oftentimes women in prison get left out of the conversation around mass incarceration. There's a host of factors that shape broader inequities in our society, and then also deeply intersect with any conversation that we might have about prisons. But one of the things that I think is a hindrance to having even a robust conversation about the place of prisons in society is in many ways the kind of everyday sort of stigma that we associate with prisons and the people who are held in them.
Thank you for that response. We're here at the community college today, and I certainly hope we have some students in our audience, either live or later on, and to view your recording. So I wanted to just close with a question of what advice do you have for college students who might be interested in becoming active in social justice issues, particularly related to rights for incarcerated people?
Oh, thank you. I think that's a great question. Not an easy question because I think that there's a lot of different ways where there are a lot of different demands on the time of college students at this moment in time. And as someone who teaches in the classroom, I'm just also sensitive to a lot of the stress that college students these days are dealing with in terms of managing families, in terms of attending to work, in terms of trying to juggle the difficulty of either online classes or anxieties that might exist about attending in-person classes, and that's sort of like how this questions of safety related to those in-person classes. That being said, I think there's really wonderful opportunities for folks who are concerned about questions of social justice and more broadly about the questions of prison, for them to there are really dynamic ways in which they can kind of get further involved in addressing those issues and concerns. We're living in a moment where folks who have been involved in these issues for some period of time have been able, in spite of all the sort of difficulties of the pandemic and the sort of turmoil politically that's been occurring, have been able to make some headway, some grounds in terms of pushing forward issues directly related to prisons and jails. One of those is pretty dynamic expansion of bail reform efforts that have taken place around the country, in cities, in towns, both small and large, efforts to sort of rethink the ways in which court systems and their associated jails operate. Additionally, there's been a pretty steady growth in terms of the focus on attending to the needs and concerns of formerly incarcerated people, and trying to find ways to ensure that once released from conditions of confinement, that they have opportunities to attend to questions of employment or education and so on. And then lastly, there's been some growth in terms of providing greater access to education, especially secondary and tertiary education, to individuals held behind bars. In Bard College, which some of those in the Hudson Valley area might be familiar with, has been sort of one of the leading institutions in terms of trying to expand access to education behind bars. These are just a couple examples of some of the kind of practical work that those who are interested in learning more about incarceration have taken up. And I think while there are pretty rich opportunities to learn more about issues of incarceration by coming to talks or watching the recordings of talks like this, or reading books, it's really also important to kind of understand an issue by engaging with those who are trying to find ways to make a difference. And so I would encourage those who are listening who want to find more ways to get involved to think about what are ways they can get involved in some of those local bail reform efforts, those sort of organizations who are dealing with the needs of formerly incarcerated people, or some of those prison education efforts, because those are some of the best ways to really try to get a better sense of how not only how the system works, but what are some of the ways, what are some of the practical things that people are doing to try to figure out ways to change it.
Thank you for those very specific and practical examples of how our students might get involved. I just want to thank you again for joining us today and starting off our series with such a compelling presentation. Thank you very much. And again, you've had set a high standard for the rest of our semester's presenters. Thank you again, Dr. Losier. Take care. Thank you.
No, thank you, and have a wonderful day.